Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I have your attention, please? All quiet, please. Thank you. All right, so hope you guys have been doing fine, and you've been watching the videos, and not only mine, but also the Cold War video from CNN right afterwards. That's pretty much how it's going to be playing out for the rest of the semester. I'll be doing my video, giving you lecture notes, giving you guidance. So you all, for each time, obviously, have your notes out. Turn to page 3. I know we've got the different headings there and so forth for episode 2, Iron Curtain, which is the one we're going to be doing today. But take very, very careful notes. This is an important segment here in the Cold War in your IB history training. So make sure you have those very, very thorough. When we get to the end of the semester, we'll have an assessment for you, and you're going to need to use those notes. And then, of course, next year, you're going to want to have those very thorough to study, to get ready for the IB exams. So here we go. Today, we're going to turn our attention to the material covered in episode 2. It's called Iron Curtain, 1945 to 1947. Let's go ahead and get this, pull this up. Here we go. There we go. All right. And some people call this time period right after World War II the beginning of the Cold War. This is where tensions really kind of become official. And, you know, it's one of those interesting questions, like, who's to blame for the Cold War? Who started the Cold War? You know, was it Truman, when President Truman for the United States, when, as a result, you'll see it today, the United States starts taking a very, very strong position relative to the Soviet Union and Europe and beginning in other parts of the world? Or is it, you know, the Soviet Union, Stalin, that is pushing his advantage in Eastern Europe and so forth? Well, I suppose it depends on who you talk to. For my purpose, there is a lot of interesting information going on both sides, but there definitely was a Cold War. And the United States and its allies were not going to just sit on the sideline and let the Soviets carry it out. Although, for their part, the Soviets understandably felt, you know, threatened. This is something we covered in the 10th grade, when we talk about how, you can even look at right here in the map. When you look at the boundary for the Soviet Union, for traditionally Russia, in a sense, they kind of pushed and created this, pushed the boundary to the west, and created this almost like a buffer zone. I mean, it was like, what, have they ever been invaded by countries coming from? Oh yeah, they have, multiple times. I mean, when you think of it, Napoleon started his attack in 1812 against the Russians right here in Poland, okay? And then World War I, we had Germany, you know, doing a big number on Russia, and the same thing in World War II. So from the Soviet perspective, from their security perspective, in their minds are like, yeah, a little justification here, having friendly puppet governments here in Eastern Europe. That all makes sense for security purposes, because they see what's going on in the West as a threat. Of course, the countries in the West are like, no, actually, the fact that the Soviets have troops in Eastern Europe and are beginning to influence the government and doing all kinds of various different things is a threat to Western Europe. Yeah, so we're going to have this shared feeling of threat, and very, very different ways of looking at the world, different ideologies and different attitudes toward freedom and democracy and free speech and so forth, and politics, how that's all going to play out. This is a big part of the Cold War. So let's get into the details here of this stage, the early stages of the Cold War. Okay, you guys ready? All right. So one of the interesting things that we're going to see actually take place is a speech, and it's going to be given by Winston Churchill. Oh, there he is, Winston Churchill. And he's not the Prime Minister of Britain. Remember that? Toward the end of World War II. In fact, the European phase had finished. Britain's like, hey, let's have a national election. And they voted Churchill and the Conservative Party out, and they put the Labour Party in. Clement Attlee was the leader of the Labour Party, and they instituted all kinds of things like national health and so forth. So Winston Churchill had a lot of time on his hands, and he was writing and painting, doing all kinds of things. And of course, he's very respected, especially in the United States. And he came to the United States on an invitation of President Truman. You can see President Truman, Harry Truman, right here, right near Winston Churchill. He was invited to Fulton, Missouri. Of course, Missouri is the home state of Truman. And he's given a graduation speech. It's weird they're graduating in March. Anyway, given a graduation speech. And Churchill uses that speech as an opportunity to warn the United States, warn the free world, warn the Western countries that the Soviets are a threat. And people need to step up. The United States needs to step up. Now, Truman had a sense of what kind of was coming in this speech, and he will listen very carefully because he does have a lot of respect for Winston Churchill. But it's almost like reminiscent. It was like, go back, another dozen or so years, and you had Churchill in Britain warning the British and others, anybody else who would listen, that Hitler was a threat, and he was going to be dangerous to the world. And so now here we've got Churchill saying the Soviets are a threat. And in fact, in his speech, he's a very good writer, very good speaker, a very clever crafter of words. Churchill talks about how an iron curtain has descended upon Europe from the Baltic Sea in the north all the way down to the Mediterranean Sea. And behind that iron curtain, that boundary, east of which are the Soviet Red Army, and the Soviet Red Army is imposing a totalitarian rule on the captive peoples there, the East Germans, the Poles, the Czechs, and the Slovaks in Czechoslovakia, the Hungarians, Romanians, Bulgarians, not Yugoslavia, because remember Tito, those guys, the partisans there, threw the Nazis out. But anyway, so there's that line. That's the Iron Curtain. And so basically what Churchill says in his speech to the American people is the United States needs to step up. This is not like after World War I, where the United States, especially after Wilson got, was not able to get the Versailles Peace Treaty through the United States Senate. And the United States went into very much an isolationist mode. Churchill's like, no, you can't be isolationist now. You're the leader of the free world. Yeah, you can't do that. There's too much at stake. And this is going to be a period, the end of 1945 and going into 1946 and 47. This is going to be a period where the United States public opinion is going to start shifting. Republicans and Democrats alike, many of them start looking and saying, yeah, we're going to be responsible here. We're going to step up and we're going to be active in the world, financially, militarily, because we don't want to have things go really, really bad. And, Hitler's gone, Tojo, Mussolini, they're gone, but Stalin is a threat. And then we'll see what happens in China when Mao Zedong and the communists take control there. That's a threat. So the United States is going to play a very, very active role. And this is that important transition. So in these notes, in this episode, we look at some of the events that were taking place at the end of World War II. I mean, in one sense, Americans are like, hey, we're done, we can have a baby boom. We can we're not doing the Depression anymore. We can be very content and the economy's great and everything's great. But if you were in Europe, right, for example, if you were in Berlin, Berlin was like almost completely destroyed. It was very, very hard to survive. You're going to hear testimony in the film about Soviet soldiers going around and looking for women and girls to have their way with, and starvation. I mean, it's just horrible. It's just a horrible situation. Well, some people be like, well, you deserve it. You were on the losing side. But then afterwards, Hitler's gone. And, what's going to be done about it? Reminder to you, you see this map right here. You got the occupation zones. This is part of an agreement by the big three. Of course, France got a chunk there too. This is the western part, French zone, British zone, American zone, and there's the eastern zone of Berlin. And those are the occupation zones as well. And so you had difficulties in that part. What kind of government's going to come out? How are things going to play out there? Tension turns, you'll see in the video as well, to Poland. That was, wow. I mean, you look at the blue boundaries. That was the original boundary of Poland before World War II. Okay, and they got invaded by the Soviets from the east and Germany from the west. and they divided it up into two. Well, when the Soviets removed the Germans from Poland, they kept their part. This part right here, the eastern part, is going to remain part of the Soviet Union. Germany will lose some of its territory, and Poles will be pushed into that. So you're going to have, what, 12 million Germans expelled in what will become now Western Poland. I mean, it's just going to be, wow, crazy. It's very interesting because at the end of the Cold War, when Germany was reunited, East and West Germany was reunited and everything's cool like that, Poland was like, are you guys cool with the new boundaries? Because, you know, I don't think we're going to get our territory back from Russia or, you know, whatever, Lithuania and Belarus and so forth. And Germany's like, yeah, we're not going to be trying to get any of our old territory back. But you can see there was a big chunk of it that did get shifted, okay? The British, oh yeah, here we go, I'm sorry. With the Soviets in control of Poland, they do not want the old Polish leadership to make any kind of return to power. So they're going to be looking around for like-minded communists. And this guy right here, you're going to see him in the video, General Wojciech Jaruzelski. He's identified very early on, pro-communist, and he is going to rise through the ranks. In fact, he is going to be ultimately the leader of the communist state in Poland all the way up until the very, very end of the Cold War. If you're wondering, by the way, he does wear glasses. He's got an eye condition, and so he's got like a sunglasses tint thing. So you'll see that when you watch the video. Yeah, and he's like, you know, it's not just like, oh, I'm too cool to wear shades and so forth and anything like that. He has an eye condition. Okay, so General Jaruzelski. Stalin is always going to be looking for people who will be communists, but compliant communists, not like come up with some new ideas. As we go through the Cold War, we're going to see that there's going to be some communists that Stalin will not like because they don't do his bidding. He wants compliant. Now, with respect to, let me pause here for a moment, just to give you sort of a sense of like what the heck is going on in Britain. We still have Clement Attlee as the prime minister, and they're having a really, really hard time. I mean, they're still on rations in Britain after World War II. They don't have the kind of supplies, consumer supplies that are available in normal times. And you're like, the war's over. No, they're still on rations. And yet people will look to them, Germans and other places that are, you know, destroyed during World War II. They're going to be looking to the British, help us out. We're starving here. It's going to be part of the message coming out from Churchill is like, United States, you know, you didn't get blown to pieces as part of World War II. You didn't feel it quite as bad as many of the other parts of Europe. You need to step up, and the United States will. Yeah, let's turn our attention to this man right here. You want to write in your notes all about George Kennan. He was one of the top diplomats for the United States in the Soviet Union. He was working in Moscow, the capital city, observing what was going on. I mean, we had one of, you know, he knew what he was talking about. I mean, he understood. He knew Soviet history, knew Russian history. He's looking at what is going on in Soviet-occupied areas of Eastern Europe. And he's really, really, really concerned. And he wants the President of the United States, Harry Truman, right? I mean, President of the United States, I mean, he'd only been, you know, a US Senator up until fairly recent, you know, the beginning of 1945 when he was the vice president, and then he became president. And so George Kennan's like, I think I need to make sure that President Truman really knows what's going on. And I need to give him the full story, okay? So just to give you a little bit of a context, what you guys are going to be writing, what, an extended essay for what, is that like 4,000 words? This guy whips out in one day 2 extended essays on the Soviet Union's history and what they're up to in 1945, 46. It's called The Long Telegram. He basically wants to make sure through a secure communication device that President Truman gets the lowdown on what's really going on. And what he basically says in that long, long telegram is the Soviets are up to no good. They make promises. Oh yeah, everybody can come back in Eastern Europe and they can all do their thing and there'll be freedom and self-determination, democracy, yada, yada, yada. But he's like, well, let me tell you what's really going on. Let me tell you what the Soviets are really up to and what their ideology is. And it is a warning, okay? It is a warning. So we had this, in fact, this actually predates the Iron Curtain speech, but it does help to kind of lay the groundwork for Truman hearing the Iron Curtain speech and other reports that this is serious and the United States needs to do something about it. All right, so we're getting good information from George Kennan. By the way, he was not the one going tap, 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 tap. That was another top official. You'll see her talking about her experience. I think she had a date that night when George Kennan came in and goes, I think I need for you to send a telegram. It's going to be a while. You'll have to put a rain check on your date. Sorry. Okay. So anyway, now one interesting thing. Let's go along here. Oh, I've got a nice cartoon from the time period. There's you get Stalin. It's got his pipe and so forth. And the black is the Soviet Union and the areas that he's putting pressure on, either occupied and so forth. You know, this is definitely a warning about Stalin. And let me give you some details as far as like what is going on. You got Soviet troops, obviously the Red Army in the occupied area, but what about places like Greece and Turkey and Italy and France, you know, Britain for that matter? Well, I'll tell you what, Stalin would kind of like, I mean, Russian leaders, hello, they want to have influence on the Black Sea. They want to have influence going all the way into the Mediterranean Sea. I mean, that has not gone away. And so they're putting pressure on Turkey. Stalin wants to have a pro-Soviet government in place in Turkey. It says Persia right here, known as Iran. The Soviets had troops in there during World War II, as well as the British, and they'd like to stay. You know, how's that going to play out? And right in the midst of all this, there is a civil war breaking out in Greece. And you have pro-Soviet groups that are involved in the civil war in Greece. And, you know, and Stalin's, you know, helping those guys out and so forth. Doesn't necessarily send its entire army in. I mean, that would be pushing it. But he wants to see some advantages there. And with difficult economic situations and destruction and people out of work and homes destroyed and factories destroyed and so forth, there's a lot of discontent. Places like Italy and in France, and you have traditional left-wing socialist and even some communist movements in those countries, and they're kind of looking around and saying, you know, we need some more changes, da, 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 da. And of course, Stalin sees this as an opportunity to like really make hay and gain some advantage at the very least, you know, kind of maybe peel them away. So perhaps like Austria, Switzerland, Sweden, Finland, they'll end up neutral. I mean, Italy and France, neutral. So these are the kinds of things that are popping up in George Kennan's long telegram, and Truman's reading about this, and Churchill is putting the word out to the Soviets. Excuse me, to Truman. You need to watch out for this, right? In the meantime, there's discussions because obviously we've got Germany, including Berlin, part of Germany, is under occupation by the Soviets, the British, the French, and the Americans. And there's discussion as far as like, you know, what's going to happen next. Well, we saw, you know, the Soviets are like, you know, we're going to dismantle your factories and take everything back in the areas that we occupy. Well, it's fascinating because in the zones occupied by the United States, Britain, and France, the American, British, and French opinion quickly turns to a position of, we're not going to make the Germans that live in the areas we occupy, we're not going to make them continue to pay like reparations and da-da-da-da. We want them to actually rule over themselves with a democracy and protection of rights and things like that that we never really saw, you know, perhaps previously, certainly not during Hitler's time. we want to see that take place. We would actually kind of like, you know, those Western areas of Germany and the Western parts of Berlin to ultimately, you know, continue on and be our friends, and not be under our thumb, right? So these are discussions that are taking place among the top foreign policy leaders, all right? So we got James Byrne, who's the Secretary of State for Truman, and he's actually located right here in the middle, okay? Then we got Vyacheslav Molotov, who's the Soviet foreign minister. So that's Stalin's guy, and he was actually the guy that signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact at the beginning of World War II, splitting Poland up between the Soviets and the Nazis. So, I mean, he's been involved for quite some time. There is Molotov, this guy right here, I believe is Sir Anthony Eden, who was the foreign minister for Britain. Okay, so I found a picture that had the two of them in there, this guy too. Oh, by the way, if you're wondering, the Molotov cocktail, there you go. During the Winter War, the Finnish dubbed the petroleum bomb as Molotov cocktail to mock the Soviet foreign minister Molotov. Right, so basically it's a petrol bomb. You fill it up with gasoline, you put a rag in it, you light it, you throw it really quickly because otherwise it's going to blow up in your hand. But it's a cheap way of making weapons when you have a population that's trying to fight off some kind of a group that has official weapons and that population doesn't. So you got bottles, you got gas, and that's what they use. Anyway, for your information, a Molotov. Here's the thing, though. So, Secretary of State Byrne, on behalf of our president, Truman, makes a speech, you'll hear about it, in Germany, in Stuttgart, Germany, the western part of Germany, and where we make it very clear that we want the Germans to rule themselves. We want them to move forward as a democracy, as a capitalist democracy. And so, yeah, we're, you know, quickly there's going to be at odds with, you know, what's going to happen with the Germans. The British, French, and the United States have one set of ideas, and the Soviets have a whole different set of ideas. So we're going to see some tension going on there. And of course, the British are having a real hard time providing food for Germans who are starving, right? I mean, you've got, this is actually a picture from, I believe, Berlin. Could be any number of cities in Germany devastated by strategic bombing during World War II. You have, I mean, this is day after day after day. You know, it's like, it's not like, you know, oh, a quarantine, now you can go outside and play. No, your buildings are destroyed. There's starvation. I mean, like, the British don't want everyone to starve and so forth, but they are having a hard time feeding themselves, even now that the war is over. So you've got rationing going on there. And as I mentioned, you've got, you know, communists organizing in Britain, France, and Italy, and Germany. And then, of course, you've got the situation in Greece and in Turkey, where the Soviets are looking for advantage there. And it's like, what is going to happen? All these things. Will the United States, will President Truman, will the Congress, Senate, House, representing the public opinion across the country, will there be a change of attitude? Will the United States step up? Will we put money into the recovery of Europe? Will we put weapons? Will we say, basically, look, here is a line, Stalin, don't cross it. These guys are a part of our team. Are we going to step up? On March 12th, 1947, President Truman gave an address, a speech to a joint gathering of Congress. The House of Representatives is the bigger room. So you had senators, members of the House, you had television, and basically Truman says, look, I'm asking you, Congress, to fund money to stop what the Soviets are up to. We can see this is a dangerous game, and we want to stop. Contain, write that down. Containment is the idea. We want to contain the spread of communism, Soviet influence. And in order to do that, we need to put our money there. We need to provide relief. And we're going to see that in our next episode. It's called the Marshall Plan European Recovery Act. We got a hint of it in previous notes. We're going to get a lot more detail next time. And so And he gets a lot of positive response from his party, the Democratic Party, and Republican Party. In fact, during the Cold War, you're going to see actually both sides at various different times, Republicans and Democrats, saying, no, we're tougher against communism. No, we're tougher against communism. Da, 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 da. You know, very, very interesting. You're going to see a lot of support. Not everyone's like, oh, yeah, let's go spend a bunch of money because we got a lot of things to do here at home, but a majority, in fact, a pretty distinct majority, you're going to say that. And specifically, there will be what is called the Truman Doctrine. You see that right there? One specific component of the Truman Doctrine is this third bullet point I found on this slide here, which is that we're going to give economic and military support to Greece and Turkey. We draw the line. We basically say, hey, Stalin, stay out of Turkey, stay out of Greece. They're part of our team. And eventually Greece and Turkey, even though they're rivals with each other, they will both end up being part of the military alliance, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In fact, they both are still today. It's a little bit more complicated today, but we're getting into all the details as far as like, what kind of government do they have in Turkey? But I mean, there'll be a point where we'll have like front line nuclear missiles in Turkey pointed at the Soviets. They don't really like that. I mean, like, what are they going to do? Try and get nuclear missiles in some country near the United States? Yeah, we'll get to the Cuban Missile Crisis later. But yeah, the Truman Doctrine, here we go. Truman will get that. And here we go. We got a serious Cold War going on, right? Make sure you watch the full video, take careful notes on that. I think I've given you the base structure of the notes so far. But continue, watch that. And we got another one coming up for you. The next one will be on the Marshall Plan, episode 3. All right, enjoy, be safe, take care.